This is Going Inside, Healing Trauma from the Inside Out. Hosted by me, licensed trauma therapist John Clark, Going Inside is a weekly podcast on a mission to help you heal from trauma and connect with your authentic self. Tune in for enlightening guest interviews, immersive solo deep dives, real-life therapy sessions, and soothing guided meditations. Follow me on socials at John Clark Therapy on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and apply to work with me one-on-one at johnclarktherapy.com. Thanks for being here. Let's dive in. Christine Dixon is an educational therapist for over 20 years. She became a radical pragmatist, testing out various healing methods to help with her own trauma. When she discovered IFS, it felt as if her whole life had led to this modality. She's now an IFS educator and group facilitator, following her fascination and inviting others to come along. I almost made it through that without stuttering or fumbling, but we're human here, right? Thanks for doing this, Christine. The way I came across you was following your Instagram and all of the really great content you put out there, even these, especially these little hand-drawn things that you do with parts and kind of illustrating parts. I've found so neat and useful. Stick figures. Yeah, I'm a big fan of those. But yeah, how are you doing? Thank you again for coming on the show. And maybe you could elaborate a little on your kind of bio there and how you got here and what you're up to now and in the realm of IFS and trauma and all those things.
Yeah. So my trauma was mainly in childhood with religious trauma, some neglect, some things like that. And then, but then I ended up also up in an abusive marriage and was in that for 13 years. There was a lot of physical, emotional, mental, sexual abuse, all of it. And once I finally had the courage to leave, my first husband died by suicide. And so that was another big trauma. Later, I had trauma show up in my body and was hospitalized repeatedly. Doctors didn't know what was happening, right? And then finally realized that my trauma was kind of manifesting in my body.
Wow.
This was once I was actually safe in a safe environment, then it could start expressing itself. Yeah. And so I was very eager to find some help for myself.
Yeah.
And so that's when I started. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just a comment, is as you're, offering this kind of synopsis of what's happened and the trauma that you've been through. I also don't see a lot of like flooding happening right now or nervous system activation unless you're just hiding it super well. So clearly there's a story there behind the work you've done working through this trauma and maybe still doing work, integrating, helping your parts and all that. So I'm so curious about that because sometimes I'll see my clients that come in and just as they start their story, even the Cliff Notes version, there's this nervous system activation or there's a jitteriness, right? And attention that kind of happens. And that's often a cue for me that perhaps there's more work to be done there, right? Or when people are wanting to know like, how unresolved is my trauma or how much work do I need? How much, am I kind of over this, quote unquote, as some clients will say. And just making that comment.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. I'll be transparent. Before I come on anything like this, or even the groups that I lead or clients that I meet with my system for about a half an hour beforehand. And I say, who's here? Who has any fear, any anxiety, and what is it? Right. And there'll kind of be some chatter around, oh, it's fine, we're fine. But then somatically, there will be some response and I'll go. So even before this, I went and I said, who's here? Yeah. And somatically there was a little response and I said, oh, how old are you? And the response came 3, 5, and 10. So there were several. And I said, oh, what are you afraid of? And they said, I'm afraid of just being blindsided, doing something wrong, being humiliated somehow, getting it wrong. And so then I was able to say, hey, I'm here with you. Even if that happens, I'll be here with you. And so I think part of it is always turning toward whatever's alive there. And of course,
Yeah.
I have a pretty close relationship with all three of those parts, and I know them very well. So I can say, "Oh, I know what you've been through,
Yeah.
and I'm here."
Yeah.
So that's yeah. It's I often talk about that healing always occurs in this moment as we bring our loving attention to whatever's alive in us right now. And obviously, there's the deeper work that we choose to do to get to know the parts so that when they come up in this moment, we can turn toward them in that way. But
Yeah.
it's an ongoing process of this relationship, right, between the self and the whatever part comes up. Yeah.
Yeah. What I love about that is, first of all, you just gave us a really simple, beautiful way to check in with your parts, especially before doing something like this that can be activating. You're on this show, people
Yeah.
will hear it and see you and going to know something about you and now about what you've been through. And so, um, addressing parts fears and hearing them out. An example I gave one of my clients this week, and I have a convenient example in my own life that I have a toddler,
Uh-huh.
who's 3.5. And so if she
Mm,
comes to me with a fear, like, what if no one plays with me at school?
right.
And I offer some false reassurance of like, oh, I'm sure that won't happen. I
Mhm.
don't know if that'll happen or not. It could happen, right?
Yep.
So, and we unintentionally invalidate fears, right? Whether it's our kids or our parts or whatever. I'm sure you'll be fine. I'm sure that won't happen, right? Versus,
Yeah.
I get how scary that is, and if that happens, I'll be there for you, or the second your school is over, I'll be there and we can talk about it. And
Mhm.
I'm with you through that, and I get how scary that is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I asked those parts to show me when that happened. I can
right.
go back there with you, I can be with you, and that was something I discovered along the way through my own IFS process was that the response from the self, like you said, because other parts will say, "Oh, everything will be fine. Don't
Yeah,
worry about it." It'll
yeah,
kind of placate in that way or reframe or, focus on the positive. But the
yeah,
self would never say that. It would just say, "Oh, that might happen. It
yeah,
could happen, but I will be here with you." And there's so much peace in that for the parts because they're like, "Yeah, I know it could happen." And you're not denying that, right? But you'll be okay because I will be here with you. Yeah.
yeah. So powerful. Yeah, I think one cue is like, I'll tell my clients that if it feels like you're starting to even mildly argue with parts, that's
Yeah.
probably another part, right? Coming in and going, I'm sure it'll be fine, you know. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, denying
yeah,
the experience or having any kind of agenda or angst about it. Yeah.
yeah. Well, a couple directions we could kind of go today. One, always happy to hear more about you and your story, especially as it relates to working through your trauma. We had also mentioned this topic around inner critics
Mhm.
as a pretty universal topic and a very
Yeah.
common starting off point for clients doing their own parts work, right? Or
Yeah.
even a term that clients that don't know about IFS might come in with. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
what sounds good to you?
Yeah. No, I would love to talk about that. That's actually a a big part of my own healing and of my story because
Mm.
before I knew IFS, I learned the Enneagram. I'm not sure if you're familiar
Okay,
with the
yeah.
Enneagram.
Only somewhat, yeah, but I know people are integrating the models and, yeah,
Yeah.
offering those similarities.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was at a conference and discovered that I'm an Enneagram type, or, well, there's all kinds of things I believe about how the Enneagram fits with IFS, but my parts predominantly protected me by becoming an Enneagram 1, which is the
Mm,
perfectionist. And I remember the facilitator saying, you're an Enneagram 1 if you have a really harsh inner critic. And I said, "Oh,
yeah.
yeah, that's me." Right. And she said, "It can be even helpful to name your critic." And she gave a story where someone had named their critic Gertrude. So I started calling my critic, well, now I know I actually have five, but we'll get to that. Um, so I started calling this kind of very inner critical voice Gertrude. eventually, once I learned IFS, I went in directly and I asked her, "What is your name?" I said, "Is your name Gertrude?" And she said, "Oh, no." I said, "What is your name?" She said, "My name is Edna."
Mm,
And I said, "Okay, I'll call you Edna." And so she appears, and so for me, I'm very visual.
yeah.
She appears kind of like this old woman with her finger out like this. And she's actually my social critic. So she um, is the keeper of all the rules. She had a lot of cultural burden around all the
Mm,
shoulds and the shouldn'ts and the have tos and the musts, and you must do this and must not do that to kind of fit in, right? And so um, I got to know her very well, unburdened her. There's a lot of layers, cultural burden, experiences,
wow.
and she transformed into kind of this kind grandmother that bakes cookies and encourages, and kind of lets you know a little bit. Oh, hey, you might want to check that out, but is definitely not burdened. And we can talk more if you want about other critics that I've met. But
Well, I'm very interested, and also I am amazed at how so often I've seen this in my clients and in myself. When an unburdening happens, the way that our parts can often change shape or
mm-hmm,
role or age,
mm-hmm,
appearance,
mm-hmm.
or they want to do things like make cookies or go play or make music or dance or something in that realm, right?
Yeah,
That is
yeah.
very much not like, oh my gosh, I went from doing this job that felt very high stakes for a very long time to making cookies or playing,
Mm-hmm,
right? And I'm
mm-hmm.
I'm just always amazed at how parts often they know exactly what they would rather do if they weren't doing this job inside your
Yeah.
system, right?
Yeah, and this part, Edna, is actually 11 years old. So she took the form
Yeah,
of this older matronly, like kind of nun or teacher, because she's essentially a type of parentified child, but she's taking that form to show her role, right? And
yeah.
but yeah, yeah, all of my parts when they unburden, they take on yeah, just these roles full of play and presence and being playfully active and creative, and it's wonderful. Yeah.
This is so incredible. And the age piece, I find such a powerful, prompt or even curiosity as I'm working with clients, right? Even early on in encountering a part, do you get an
Yeah.
idea about how old this client is? Or can you ask the client ask the part how old it is? Um, and then followed by how old does the part think you are? And there's
Yeah.
very often this discrepancy right away, right? Oh, so the part is 4 and the part thinks you're 4. Got it. Okay. So can you let the part
Yeah.
know that you're not 4? Even just some light updating there, right? And there's often this
Mhm.
kind of, um,
Shock.
this shock. They're kind of perplexed of like, "Oh my gosh, you're not 4?" Right? And that
Yeah.
updating of the part can often just be such a powerful, moment for the client and their parts.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I found that often that if I can just receive an answer from the part, say, "How old do you think I am?" It's often single digits that, 10
Yeah,
or younger that they think I am. And I can say, "Oh, well, of course, then you don't trust me, or you don't, think I can handle this." And sometimes they're pointing, I think, at another part they're polarized with. And sometimes they're actually so fixated on the exile that they think I'm the exile, right? And
yeah,
so updating them can help. And periodically, though, I want to point out sometimes they'll say, "Yeah, I know you're older, but you still can't handle this. Like,
right.
you're not equipped." And I'll say, "Who's not equipped? Like, tell me more about it." Because sometimes they still are pointing at another part that's
Yeah,
been running the show.
so true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then all of a sudden, you might have 3 or 4 parts in the room at once at a given
Mhm.
moment, when doing
Right.
parts work, whether it's doing your own parts work or with, a an IFS therapist or guide or whatever. Yeah, facilitator.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So as you got to know this inner critic, that is one of a handful and walked through this unburdening process, she took a different role very different
Mhm.
shape, changed age. And then how did that shift things in your system, or what did that look like in terms of even the practicalities of your daily life in your experience of that
Yeah.
inner critic, those shoulds, those musts, that tension of I'm not doing enough or I'm somehow not enough.
Yeah, yeah, significantly. So first I
Mhm.
want to say, because kind of one step I think, at least in my journey that we kind of skipped, is that I before I met IFS, I had been learning self-compassion, through Kristen Neff's work and different things like that. And I had learned how to bring self-compassion basically to the exiles, right? The parts that felt really big emotions, felt wounded, um, and I had experienced all my life these really big shame spirals. So one of my biggest critics is what's called a destroyer, right? Which is kind of like almost a murderous suicidal part.
Mhm.
And so I would have these very big shame spirals. And I began to learn to give self-compassion to the wounded parts, but it wasn't until I learned through IFS to give compassion to the critics that those shame spirals were healed. And because I would feel, the shame and I would give compassion to it, but then the critic would keep, would get bigger usually and kind of
Yeah.
compete. But so once I gave first this compassionate witness curiosity to Edna, and I got to understand how she came by her job honestly, right? And how she was protecting me. She had learned all of these things. If you do this or you don't do that, you will be punished, you will be criticized, you will be rejected, you will be abandoned, and I am protecting you. I had such appreciation for her. So then when she would show up in my life, I think it's wonderful to have a name and to know when that part, kind of what they say to you or how they present in your body, because then
Yeah.
I could turn toward her and say, "Ah, Edna." And for me, the word was should, right? So whenever there was a should, I would
Yeah.
say, "Oh, Edna, you're here. Tell me what you're afraid of." And she would say, "Oh, you've got to do this or that." And I would say, "Oh, remember, I'm here. I'm taking care of this part. Is there another part you need me to go to?" Or, just that relationship of turning toward her, she kind of began to
Yeah.
soften into, instead of saying you should do this, you should do that with this really big angst, she would say, you could do this.
Oh, wow.
Eh, You
Yeah, it's a
could.
big shift. Yeah.
So I mean, just the simplest things. I remember early on, I would notice her all through the day, just
Yeah.
should this, of just running everything. And so I would walk by the dishwasher and she'd say, "You should empty the dishwasher." Right? And I would say, "Oh, I see you. What are you afraid would happen if I didn't? You would be considered lazy. You would, all of these things." And then as she began to relax, she would say, "You could empty the dishwasher." Like there was more of a choice,
Yeah.
right? And
It's
then I would
incredible.
say,
Yeah.
"Do we want to?" "Yeah, sure." "No, we don't want to right now. We'll do it later." There was less urgency around things and less
Yeah.
shame around not doing the right thing. Uh, yeah, it was really significant.
There's a tension when we're being led by our parts, right? Or walking by and
Yes.
having that should, and then immediately jumping into doing the dishes and feeling this tension of perhaps I don't even know why, but it feels like there would be a consequence if I don't do these dishes, even though it's
Mhm.
just me, an adult at home alone, right? And then,
Right.
right, we're off and running, and yet, parts when they're no longer polarized, they can become almost like partners or co-pilots or consultants, even, right? Of like
Right.
this part that really wants you to do well. Gosh, I get that. Gosh, I so appreciate how you want me to do well, even in my own world of having some powerful inner critics, even that about my own clinical work or wanting to be a good therapist. Gosh, I
Right.
get that. You really want me to be a good therapist. You want to make sure I'm doing good work, or I have high standards for the type of work I'm doing. And yet when we get into trouble, or when it's distressing, again, when those parts are polarized and everything feels so high stakes, or someone in my life has even an ounce of feedback for me and a part
Right.
jumps in, right, and tightens
Mhm.
up and my stomach gets tight and my throat, you know, feels weird, and all of a sudden I'm bracing for impact, right,
Yeah.
and I'm getting ready to fight or run away or whatever it is, or shut down, or to your point about shame, right,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and that person may or may not have even been offering critical feedback at all. It's just like I
Yeah,
tell
there's a
my clients, like,
hypervigilance. Yeah.
yeah, like, if you're looking at your phone and you see a text from someone important in your life and it just says, "Hey, can we talk?"
Oh. That's
Or whatever it is, right? And then,
yeah.
boom, there's a part there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's I think especially with inner critics, I like, are you familiar with Martha Sweezy's more recent book, Internal Family Systems for Shame and Guilt?
Got it on my shelf, I haven't cracked into it yet, but
Oh,
people,
it's so
you're
good.
not the first one to mention that, so
It's
that's
so
good
good.
praise for the book.
I have a whole YouTube series on me
Awesome.
talking about this book because it's so good. She has over 200, examples of IFS sessions around this, but she talks about the 6 acts of the shame cycle.
Mm,
And I'll just go through the first 3 real quick,
great,
but
yeah.
the first one is that something bad happens to us,
Yeah,
right? And then the second one is that we accept that as meaning that something's wrong with us, right? That so we a part of us takes on I am bad. And so then the third act she calls critics go large. And this is where a big critic comes in to say, you're right, you are bad, right? And then says, and the critic's intention often is, okay, I'm learning that this quality or this, it could be anything from showing an emotion like anger or sadness or fear or sensitivity or sexuality or, it could be anything, right? It could be the way you look, anything. It says, okay, this thing is so shameful and is going to make you not safe or acceptable to your caregivers or your peers. So I'm going to exile that. I'm going to, and the way I'm going to do that is by saying, you're so bad, you're so bad, you're right, you're so bad, get
yeah,
away, in an effort to get the whole of us to be accepted. Like I have to exile this part in order to survive and be acceptable kind of as a whole. And so the critics learn to do that in essence to save us, even though a lot of the other parts rightfully hate the critics because they're kind of causing the very thing they don't like.
right.
And then these young parts that are holding I am bad get reinforced. I am so bad. The shame spiral just continues down. And so do you want me to go through the rest of the shame cycle?
Yeah, go for
Or
it, this is great.
so really the other parts of the shame cycle are kind of other parts that come online. So from 3 to 6, they can kind of come in any order, but there's the critics that come in, and then there's the parts that say never again, right?
Mhm.
I'm going to make sure that you look and act the right way. And in some ways, my Edna is kind of like that. But yeah, I have some some much harsher inner critics. I remember when I got to know them, I said, "Are you Edna?" There's one named Gollum that appears like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, and he said, "Oh no, I am much meaner than her."
Right, wow.
And I said,
Oh,
"Oh, okay." But
alright, nice to meet you. It's
yeah,
like
yes. So he's a big one that I will turn toward and say, "Oh, Gollum, I see you're here." So the critics and then the ones that kind of keep us in line, a lot of those managers, right? I'm going to
yeah,
manage the world around you. I'm going to manage you, your behavior, your appearance, so that this bad thing will never happen again. And of course, they have good intention. But then we also can go to Act 5, which is, I think she calls it. I have it. I have it over here. Hold on. Oh, the warrior mutiny, which is kind of these
mm,
angry, raging parts that push out. So they say, um, "I'm not bad, you're bad," right? And again, they're trying to counteract the critics and to kind of create some balance here.
yeah,
They're like, we can't handle all of this feeling bad inside. Let's push it out. No, you're bad. And then the final one is the rescue team, which is the firefighters of numbing, escaping, binging, dissociative parts that say, there's so much pain and shame in the system. I'm going to soothe you. I'm going to
Yeah.
help you.
I'm gonna do something
And
about it.
so,
Yeah.
so usually when people come into therapy or coaching, sometimes they have exiles at the surface, but a lot of times they're aware of this really extreme behavior of all of these parts that are trying to protect them, right? Big critics or raging parts, addictive parts, managers and things. And so, as you know, in IFS, the solution is to then come back to Act One and say, what is the bad thing that happened?
Yeah.
And bring the self energy into that. And can we witness that? And can we then unload the burden of I am bad,
Yeah.
right? And or what was taken on as meaning from that. So anyway, but I wanted, what I really wanted to highlight was this whenever we have these shame spirals in our lives, there's
Mhm.
always a shamed one and a shamer inside, right?
Yeah.
There's the accused and the accuser, and just dealing with one and not the other is not going to help that, that dynamic. But of course the self has the capacity to be with them all and see the good intention, accept, appreciate, love them, all of that, and say, can I help? What if I could help?
Yeah. Amazing. I'm always, in awe of how when we go in and we kind of bear witness to the part's story about how they took on this role. Sometimes it's a dramatic big T trauma story.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's as seemingly benign as I was 7 and I played, violin in my recital and I missed a few notes. And on the way home, my mom just didn't talk to me.
Right.
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 So part came online and said, well, in order for that to never happen again and for mom to not withdraw love or people to not love me anymore, I'm going to be more perfect than ever and never miss a note again. Right. And then in
Right.
my case, living in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, in the tech world, 30 years later, people come in and they've been that part has been in the driver's seat for 30 years, making me,
Yeah.
leading me to be as perfect as possible and as overachieving. And
Mm-hmm.
everything feels really high stakes. And they have these incredibly
Mm-hmm.
effective managers around being perfect, being efficient, right? Being buttoned up all the time, never showing weakness. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
Powerful, effective managers who are also beyond exhausted, or the cracks are starting to show in the form of I'm so perfect from 9 to 5, and then from 5 to whatever, I'm drinking myself to sleep or into oblivion or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, right?
Mm-hmm.
To try to um, kind of even things out, right? Or
Right.
I got some remotely critical feedback at work and went home and drank until I couldn't feel anymore or whatever it is, right?
Right. 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 Yeah, you're exactly right. Um, I've met so many parts in my own system and in client systems, and sometimes parts will diminish something that happened for them. They'll say, "Oh, that was
Yeah.
nothing. That can't be anything." Um, and other times they'll completely block them off, from accessing something that happened. But I know for me, one of the big traumas I had that I realize now kind of organized a lot of those parts that are in that shame cycle was when I was 10. My best friend of the last 3 years that I spent every day with said to me on the front lawn of the primary school, you're fat and ugly, and I can't be your friend anymore. And I found out later that some of the popular girls had told her, you can be in our group if you disown Christine. And she never talked to me again. I went on, I had other friends, I did, different things. And my system had really diminished that experience. But
Yeah.
when I went back in my, with all my parts, I realized that I had these, because she had said I was fat, I developed this part that controlled my eating,
Yeah.
right? And controlled my body. Um, she said I was ugly. I had parts that controlled, my appearance. Just the thinking, well, maybe if I'm perfect, like you said, then I won't experienced this kind of rejection. So perfectionists came online. I ended up trying to get perfect grades, trying to get approval from teachers, trying to get, approval anywhere I could, to kind of just all of these parts that developed, and people pleasing parts, and really that have let me know they came on as this army in that one moment, and then they
Yeah.
and then they ran my life for the next 30 plus years.
It's incredible, to your point, or in a point that was made kind of in your introduction, your bio is, and this was my experience, is, after being a therapist for, 10, 11 years and doing things a certain way, and even doing things like, working from a cognitive perspective. So a client comes in and says, I'm worthless. And you kind of work with the cognition of that, right? Like, what's the proof that you're worthless? What's the proof that you're not, maybe not worthless? Is there a replacement thought for that, right? And you're kind of,
Right.
it can provide relief, but in a way, and now that I know IFS, I'm kind of arguing with this part that took on this belief in a very emotionally charged moment, right, like yours,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of coming in and saying, "You're wrong for holding this belief," right?
Right.
Um, it's like the part holds the belief of I'm not enough, and just coming in and going, "You're enough, you're enough, you're enough," right? I used to work
Yeah.
with kids with behavioral issues here in San Francisco, like in the public school district. And one of the most activating things you could do would be to praise a kid, right? Or to say, "Wow,
Mm-hmm.
you're so good," right? Or "You
Yeah.
did a great job," or "You are," in other words, like, "You are worthy of love."
Yeah.
And I remember at the time, like, giving that type of praise in whatever way and seeing how activating it was for some of these kids, right? Because
Yeah.
again, I'm going in just like these dominant parts in them that have been abused and traumatized and beaten down, and going, you're totally fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then wondering why there's this kind of backlash and
Mm-hmm.
intense rejection of that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then now
Mm-hmm.
seeing that through a part's perspective, it's like, well, that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah, and on the flip side too, even if, so in my case, teachers and things would give me that kind of approval, and I
Mm,
would say I was addicted to it.
yeah,
I
yeah,
had to get that in order to feel like I had any worth, right? So
wow, yeah,
so it became this very dependent relationship, and desperation, right? I have to get this supply of approval, and great good grades, and all of that. But but it was exhausting, because it was like, but if you really found out who I really am,
yeah,
you would not love me, because those parts still really held so much shame. And what's interesting to me is the self, because you were saying, I think when you were talking about kind of that cognitive behavioral therapy of, or cognitive therapy of,
yeah,
well, the opposite, and kind of that it's really other managers that are trying to help, and so many modalities. That's, I think, the best they have to offer is,
yeah,
here's another manager to try to counterbalance
that's
this
right,
polarization,
yeah,
right? A burden system's way of trying to achieve balance. But what's interesting is when myself would go in to these parts that held this I am bad, I am unlovable belief, it's just the presence of the self. It's like, I call it the loving gaze,
yeah,
right? It was just like, I see you and you are delightful. And it's like that part just knows that it's loved, without even having to be
incredible,
told, no, you are enough, you are enough, you are enough. It's like it demonstrates and shows that,
yeah.
and by attuning, I guess.
Well, yeah, I love that. And so I also, teach IFS to the clinicians that work at my practice. I own a teaching practice here, and a
Hmm.
lot, sometimes because we can be so eager to kind of go through the steps, or even looking at like the steps for unburdening, we can kind of blow past
Mm,
this really pivotal moment of you're there with a part, perhaps just asking to hear its story, or is there anything it wants to share with you? And maybe that part goes right into that story or right into that moment for you of being bullied, and just hanging out there and going, if it's okay, just let that part tell you that story. Can you just kind of hang out there with the part as it shares this story? Is there more to
Mhm.
share? Does it want to tell you more or show you more? And a lot of times they
Mhm.
do, right? And this might be decades of
Mhm.
this part not having, a place to tell their story, and not having self of, and not trying to fix it, right? Especially the way we do in our
Right,
lives
right.
of just like, well, but you turned out okay, and look at you, and but you got good grades, or whatever we would
Yeah,
do
yeah.
to unintentionally minimize your pain or
Right,
your
right.
wounding, right? But just this, like you said, the presence of self, and going, yeah, just be there with the part and hear that story entirely.
Mhm.
And perhaps after that moment, there is more steps to take of bringing the part into the present, or actually letting go of something, thoughts, feelings, beliefs, whatever, installing new qualities, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera. But yeah, so powerful, just that witnessing piece.
Yeah, yeah, I think, with that particular part, I remember, again, I'm visual, but in my mind's eye, just sitting on the grass in front of the primary school, rocking with her, hugging her, saying, I'm here with you.
Yeah,
You're not alone. I really get how devastating this is for you, right? And um, I feel emotional now, like just the bonding that happened of not trying to fix it, not trying to go anywhere, but just I see you and I get it. I get how bad this was for you. And tell
yeah,
me whatever you want to tell me. And I like, to your point about saying, is there anything else? Is there anything else? I teach this, with the witnessing step. Is there anything else? Is there anything else? Is there
yeah,
anything else? And you don't stop until they say, yeah, that's it.
yeah,
And sometimes I've had experiences where they tell me one thing and that's it. And I've had with my people pleasing part, she told me things more and more and more for a year and a half. And this, and this,
yeah.
and this, because it was really complex trauma, right? It was just moment
Right,
after moment after
right.
moment. And I really want you to go and be with me here and here and here, or all of these parts, right? That she was protecting. So again, I love
Yeah.
to say that, the witnessing can last 2 minutes or 2
Oh my
years.
gosh. Well, and also this is why it's so important that we keep going back to parts, right? Or if you reach
Yeah,
this moment and there's 10 minutes left in the session, or 5
yeah,
minutes left, or whatever, and then the client comes back the next time, and you go, okay, all right, where should we start today? And we start somewhere totally new, right? You've
right.
got this vulnerable little one still there waiting on the lawn of the school, wondering like, is anyone coming back for me, right? Also,
Yes,
why the
yeah.
integration and the following up piece is so important, right? Checking in
Mhm,
on her every day, 21 days, or
mhm,
whatever you choose to do there. But going back, and I think one piece that I share with my clinicians who are learning IFS is a quality that I really love and can feel in myself, when I'm in self, is not having an agenda. And then my clients'
mhm.
parts can feel that, right? Like, I don't need this to go anywhere today.
Right.
Nothing needs to happen, quote unquote, right? Or if we find a part, it's like, again, nothing needs to happen today with this part to either
Yeah.
do some great unburdening, or not do an unburdening, or just to hang out with the part, or just to sit here feeling really stuck,
Mhm,
today. And that might be the work. And so for me, like, one of my primary jobs, so to speak, in doing the work, is being in that place and being in
yeah, yeah,
self as
exactly.
much as possible. And when I can feel even physically that I
Mhm.
don't have an agenda, I'm trying to stay there,
Yeah,
right, in session. On the other hand, there's moments where there's parts of me that are eager and want to jump in, or my therapist parts that want the session to go somewhere today, right? Or
right.
want to show someone that IFS is really great and it could change your life, right? And so what if we could
Yeah.
do an unburdening today, right? And all of that starts to
Mhm.
feel like tension and starts to feel like an agenda. And then the client's parts can feel it too, right?
That's right. Yes, yeah, that's why I feel like, when I meet with groups or when I meet with clients, the best thing I can possibly do is to meet with my own system
Yeah.
beforehand. Because when I'm giving that attention, first of all, if there are any parts that are active in my own life, I've just given them attention so they can rest a little bit and not be in the forefront. And then during the whole session, there's this awareness, like you said, of parts that come up with some kind of agenda. And again, being able to turn toward them, I really imagine in my mind just saying, "Oh, I see you. Oh,
Yeah.
I get you. I appreciate you. I know you really want to have a good outcome for this client. You really want them to, be transformed, and you have such good intention." Often these are kind of self-like parts, right?
Yeah.
Um, but we know that they're not self because of that urgency, that agenda. And to just say, "Oh, can you let me lead?" Sometimes I might need to
Yeah.
meet with them, outside of sessions, but when I'm able, like you said, to be just agendaless and present with the person in front of me, usually after the session, I'm blown away. It feels like it just the client system led itself. And especially once the client is in self, I'm just sitting back and they're doing everything because the self knows what to do. So it
Yeah.
always goes better. And then those parts that had agenda, can look and say, "Oh yeah, it does go better."
Yeah. Well, and that piece of defaulting to the client's system and to the client's access to self energy is so
Yeah,
powerful and something I'm thinking about all the time, right? Especially when I am stuck or a little unsure of what to do in the session, right?
right.
Or which part needs your help today the most, right? And there's a lot going on, or even just in life, there's a ton going on. And so slowing it all down, letting parts speak up, helping the client hear from those parts, ideally one at a time, or conference
Mhm.
table or around a fire, whatever it's going to be.
Right.
And then going back to the client, right? Do you get a sense of which part needs your help? Is it okay to
Mhm.
go work with that part, and checking in with other parts about that? And sometimes once you get started, you'll know right away, and other parts either take issue with it or
Mhm.
they have, more
Mhm.
pressing needs, whatever it is. And then we're kind of in the fluidity of a session, right? And then
Mhm.
working with someone's system, and everyone's system is so different that
Right.
we can never assume that we know how this is going to go, right?
Exactly.
And so again, for the
Yeah.
therapist or the practitioner, letting go of needing to know how this is going to go, or needing to know that this is going to be a good session or a really stuck session, right? Or whatever it is.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting, something that soothes those parts for me is that we only ever have to be with whatever part is here now, right? Because sometimes there will be parts that get overwhelmed. Well, what if another one comes in and blocks the work, and then another one comes in, and then there's so many and there's confusion about who's here? Well, we just deal with whatever comes in
Yeah.
this moment and whatever comes in this moment. And so, like, some of the parts get overwhelmed because they think about so far ahead, right? Like, this, and what if this and this and this happens? Well, that might happen, but all we ever have to work with is whatever's here right now. And sometimes the process is that way, where this part comes in and blocks the way and we meet their concern, and then another part
Right.
comes in and we meet their concern, and maybe we don't ever get to the target part. But I like to say, every part is so worthy to get to know. Like,
Yeah.
sometimes practitioners and even clients sometimes will have this idea that the ideal is to get to the exile, right? You got to heal
Yeah.
these roots. But these protective parts are young too, and that they're, I say they're your inner
Yeah.
children too, and they need so much love and attention. And so
Yeah.
if we just give them love and attention right now, it's really going to be significantly worth it, in the big picture.
So true. Yeah. That piece about, that this came up in, um, group supervision at my practice recently around, kind of like looking for the exile, right? Or like,
Yeah.
some of the IFS folks will talk about that, like, exile hunting or something like that. Like that's like the big goal and going for
The
the
big
big
fish.
one. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, understanding again that that can come from a very do-gooding part of the
Right.
practitioner, right? If I really want to help, um,
Yeah.
and yet when we blow past protectors, right? And
Mhm.
I at first had learned about this idea of like backlash from
Mhm,
protectors, and
mhm.
then experienced it when with a
Yeah,
client I went too deep too fast, and we ended up, with an exile without the permission from the protectors, right? And going really, really slow with those protectors, right? Even if it
yeah.
feels too slow to some of my parts that really wanna, again, be good and efficient and get
Mhm.
somewhere, right? And the client's parts too, right? They wanna get
Right.
somewhere, but we have to go so slow, right? And really starting with
Mhm.
the protectors as a rule of thumb is, I think, a good
Mhm.
one.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had clients who, afterward, maybe they'll have dissociative parts that, take them
Sure.
out pretty severely afterward, or big inner critics that come out because how dare you be vulnerable, or how dare you, let this out, or even self-harming suicidal parts. So that's why it's so important, right? To get all of those parts permission, to really get to know them, because they are protecting for a reason, and they're really,
Yeah,
really genuinely afraid, and they are going to get really activated if they think you're going into territory that's going to, you know,
that's right.
compromise the person's safety or whatever, or the volatility of their whole system. And
Yeah,
so, yeah, I'm often saying, yes, let's go to whoever has any opinion about this. We will never steamroll over them,
right,
to try to get
right.
deeper. Yeah.
So important to check in with parts at the end of a session, or again, especially if there's been unburdening or working with an exile, and then to go back and check in with parts because sometimes, like you said, they have real issues with what just happened, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's important that we hear from that and spend time or reserve time at the end of a session really doing some of that integration piece around other
Hmm.
parts speaking up about what just happened or concerns about what this means for my role now or whatever. And I think
Hmm.
some practitioners will kind of skip past that or just not manage the clock well enough to
Right.
have time for that piece, understandably, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's funny. I have a little bit host of managers, when I meet with clients. One of them is the timekeeping one, and I
Yeah,
say, "Okay, you're allowed to do that for me."
important.
But, so yeah, we can have parts that support us, but then there's also, if that part comes in and says, "Oh, no, 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 you can't do this, you can't do that," I'll say, "It's okay. You can relax. Thank you for keeping the time,
Right,
but I can, we'll go forward and do what we can." But yeah, I love that what you're saying about um, closing in such a way as to check in with everybody. And sometimes I'll even tell a client, can you commit to even like 5 minutes after the session, just being still
totally.
and being with whatever comes up in you, and being curious about it, right? Because
That's
to
great.
validate, or that you might have some parts that that get upset or activated by it, and
Yeah.
that's normal.
When
um,
you're really bridging the gap between sessions and honoring, um, clients' autonomy that, you can and perhaps, even should consider, should keep doing the work. And as clients kind of learn that this work can be very self-led, right? And can
mhm,
continue in between sessions, right? Or
mhm,
keep working with your parts afterward, right? It could be 5 minutes. Eventually, for some clients, it's an hour, right? Or in our own work as practitioners, right? The work is kind of always happening, right? And as
right.
clients kind of learn the ropes of like
Yeah.
basic, core principles like unblending, then they can practice that, right? And
Yeah.
practice really does help, and listening really does help. I think listening is just such a big piece of this work. And again, not trying to argue or change your part's mind. And even that piece around appreciation, I
Mhm.
find is often enough, so to speak, to help a part unblend and soften. Right. Even that
Yeah.
perfectionist part, right? Just could you just send that part some appreciation for how hard it's working for you? Or for me, in my case, how hard it's working to help me be a good therapist. It really wants
Mhm,
me to be a good
mhm.
therapist. Wow, that makes so much sense. Just send that part of appreciation, and often that is enough for that softening to happen, and then
Right.
some more spaciousness to be to happen.
Yeah, I think, the more we get to know parts on a deeper level, we ask them, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't do this? And we hear their really valid reasons why they're doing this. But, ourself naturally has this appreciation for, oh my goodness, that's why you're protecting me from death, right? From abandonment, from these really severe things. You have this really good intention, even if your impact is, you know, hard for the system. You have a
Yeah,
good intention. I do appreciate it. And so then eventually, as we experience that more and more with parts, our system does, or our client's system does, then I'll tell clients and I'll say, you'll experience this, but every part does what it does for a reason. So you don't have to even know what it is initially, as long as I know there is a reason. I know there's a good intention. Let me come towards you and listen to you so that I can understand what it is. Right.
Yeah.
So then when something, even like a suicidal part, right, is really overwhelming and the system hates comes up, but you're like, okay, I know you have some kind of good intention. You have some reason why you're doing this. There's a reason why this makes sense. Then that can give us a little bit of that courage to go toward it and say, okay, tell me what your good intention is. I'm not seeing it yet.
That's great. This has flown by, and
Yeah.
just with a couple minutes left, anything that you wanted to say that perhaps we didn't get to here in the final minutes, and then of course, how people can find out more about you and follow along and learn more about working with you.
Yeah. Well, since we were talking about inner critics, one thing I was going to say is, I was saying I got to know several different critics, and one of them was, I heard Dick Schwartz talk about this, that there's kind of these two different kinds of suicidal parts. One that's like, I feel so awful, I want to die, and the other that's actually murderous. It's kind of like, you need to die, you're so pathetic, right? And that's kind of the biggest critic that I had,
Hmm.
that was causing so much pain in my system. And being able to turn toward that part and say, who are you pointing at? Who do you want to die in the system that you're willing to die, right? For this part to die. And pointing at these parts that are called pathetic and too sensitive and too emotional and just causing problems, too needy, and that was actually when what he said was that he needed my anger to come out of exile, my self-protective anger and self-agency, to come out in order to protect a little bit more, right? Because that had also been exiled. And so as you go towards these parts, they will show you the way, right, of very naturally of what needs help. And then, once that was worked with, and I mean, now I have such appreciation for the part, the murderous part that like wanted me to die. And I've had, other just really big inner critics. I don't know if you're familiar, just real quick, with Jay Early and Bonnie
A
Weiss's
little bit, yeah.
books, and they have one about inner critics, and they have, I think it's 7 different types of inner critics that, but luckily, actually, I hadn't read that before I met my critics. So it didn't kind of skew them, but I was able to go, oh yeah, you're this kind, and you're this kind, and you're this kind, right? Um, but so I just encourage people to be so curious, right, about, and to just trust that as you get to know whatever's in front of you, the puzzle pieces will eventually come into play. I mean, I didn't know back then when I met Edna that I also had these 4 or 5 other um, critics, but if you go in and ask, you will find out, like I did with the one, are you Edna? No. I'm this. And I remember then having another and saying, are you Gollum? No, I'm in charge of this, right? And as you befriend these parts, you can just turn toward them whenever they come up. You learn their tells and you say, hey, I'm here with you. I see you. I see your good intention, like you said. Um, yeah, it's just such a beautiful, beautiful modality to um, to get to know. Like
Yeah.
I have clients who say, I know more people inside of me than I do outside of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to really befriend all of these beautiful people inside of us.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm so grateful for the model, and yeah, and very grateful for your time today. Just so much richness in the conversation, and I so appreciate your um, openness with your parts and your story and your trauma. That just helps to really bring all of this to life, and just shows a lot of courage, the way that you bring your story into the work and into your work with
Mm.
clients and practitioners. Yeah, that being said, again, maybe how can people find out more about you and get in touch and work with
Yeah.
you?
Yeah, so if I do share quite a bit of my own parts work. I feel like I'm an expert in my own system. I do that on YouTube. My YouTube channel is The Ordinary Sacred. And that's really where I am everywhere is on Instagram. I'm the_ordinary_sacred. And then my website is theordinarysacred.com. And there you can access different resources. And I have a weekly group, IFS community that meets that we usually will do a check-in with what's alive in us, and then do some kind of IFS exercise together or meditation together. And then people break off into groups and share for their parts with each other. It's just a really supportive space. So yeah,
Great.
theordinarysacred.com.
Love it. Christine, thank you again for being here. We'll, of course, put links to all that in the show notes and description wherever people are listening and or watching. And obviously love to have you back anytime to go even
Yeah.
further with this stuff. So thank you again for being here. And yeah, let's keep in touch.
It's my pleasure, John. Thank you.
Thanks.